We will start. I want to welcome everybody to this lecture, to which I'm really looking forward. I'm sure most of you know Professor Dennis Deletant. He's our visiting young Ratiu Professor of Romanian Studies here at Georgetown. He's a Professor Emeritus from the London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. He's the author of several monographs, books. He's a great expert, obviously, on Romania, both in its integral period and also modern Romania. He's currently researching a study on British clandestine operations in Romania during World War II, which I'm really looking forward to reading. I'm sure that will be very interesting. And today, you are going to talk about Ion Antonescu and the temptation of fascism. Welcome.
Thank you, Angela. My apologies for having to reschedule the talk. As Angela, I was talking to Angela earlier on, and I got marooned courtesy of the Hurricane Sandy in Chicago. So it was a 2-day visit became a 5-day one. I'd like to thank Angela and also Eugene and Ben for rearranging my talk so rapidly. Just a few words about how I came to this subject. Antonescu is one of those characters, as you'll discover from my paper, who is probably amongst the most controversial in 20th century Romanian history. And I started really looking at his career about 10 years ago when I was given a fellowship at the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. The museum at that time had something like 600,000 pages of microfilm from Romania on Antonescu, but very few people had looked at the microfilm collection, largely because, as you would imagine, most of the documents were in Romanian. So one of my first tasks was to make a finding aid of several of the collections of the documents on Antonescu and especially on the deportation of Jews and Romas to Transnistria. Incidentally, on the map up there, there's an error. I've taken this from a book, but Transnistria was never formally annexed by Romania. It was administered. That's the correct term. Antonescu was offered Transnistria by Hitler, but he turned down Hitler's offer because he was hoping that he'd get back northern Transylvania there, which had been annexed by Hungary in 1940. But if you have any questions about that, certainly I'll try to answer them. So my interest in Antonescu dates from more than a decade ago, and over the years I've been following the augmentation of the Holocaust Museum's collection of documents. He periodically receives more microfilm, and occasionally I go over there to see what new material has been acquired. My paper is really based on that new material that has come to the Holocaust Museum in the last 3 or 4 years. So it, if you like, supersedes slightly my book about Antonescu, which appeared in 2006, based on my initial researches there. In 20th century Romanian history, there is no figure more controversial than Marshal Ion Antonescu. For most Western scholars, the Marshal is a war criminal, responsible for the deaths of between 250 and 290,000 Jews and between 10 and 20,000 Roma. At the same time, Antonescu's role in saving up to 375,000 Romanian Jews from deportation to Poland is acknowledged. For many Romanians, Antonescu is a national hero, a brave patriot who preserved Romania as a sovereign state during the war. In defending this sovereignty, Antonescu also saved many of Romania's Jews. These admirers of Antonescu prefer to overlook, or in some cases are ignorant, of Antonescu's excesses towards the Jews and Roma. As Vladimir Tismaneanu has argued, a pseudo-sacred aura surrounds Antonescu, and calls to dispel it are seen by many Romanians as efforts to diminish their national dignity, to offend their sense of honour, and to blacken their past. As Vladimir wrote, I quote, "In post-communist societies, fantasies of persecution offer immense gratification to large strata of frustrated individuals," end of quote. The political ground upon which the Romanian view of Antonescu is advanced is nationalism, in the version vigorously promoted by communist propaganda under Nicolae Ceausescu. His regime added to the time-honoured symbols of the Romanian nation the figure of Antonescu, who was cultivated because of his anti-Soviet policy. In the eyes of the Romanian public, Antonescu soon became the symbol of the struggle against communism in the Soviet Union, as well as the general aspiration for the recovery by Romania of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. So here's Bessarabia, northern Bukovina up there. Since the overthrow of Ceausescu in 1989, the case of Antonescu has remained, since the overthrow of Ceausescu, the case of Antonescu has remained a political matter, and only at a secondary level and historical one. Exaltation of Antonescu and the exaggeration of his political merits, combined with a minimalisation of his responsibility for the death of more than 250,000 Jews, have been used as a weapon of propaganda by those who invoke patriotism in the name of nationalism against both constitutional monarchy and democratic forces in general. Nationalist politicians in Romania, such as Corneliu Vadim Tudor, have striven to exploit sympathy for Antonescu as a weapon against the former King Michael, who was accused of having ordered the marshal's arrest and handover to the Soviets, thereby becoming the moral perpetrator of Antonescu's conviction and execution. Romanian historians are agreed on certain facets of Antonescu. All recognise his devotion to Romania, and the word patriot is commonly used to describe him. Yet the use of this word is, in Antonescu's case, inappropriate. Patriotism, as John Lukács has pointed out, is often confused with nationalism in the mind of the same person. You can be a patriot, and at least culturally speaking, cosmopolitan. Antonescu was not cosmopolitan. He had little time for Romania's minorities. Patriotism is not necessarily racist, as nationalism has to be, or may be. A patriot will not exclude a person of a different race from the community in which they have lived together and whom he has known for years. But a nationalist will always harbour suspicions towards someone who seems not to belong to the same community as he or she does, or rather does not think in the same way as he or she does. This was the mindset of Antonescu. Even so, being a nationalist or patriot does not, of course, excuse war crimes. Being a patriotic war criminal hardly constitutes grounds for entry into the gallery of a nation's heroes. A second quality attributed by Romanian historians to Antonescu was his sense of honour. Few students of Romania would dispute this appreciation, and yet Antonescu's sense of honour made him inflexible and rigid. Romania under Antonescu was led into a war on the basis of his word of honour to Hitler, and was expected to stay in the war, in the view advanced by Antonescu in his last meeting with King Michael on the 23rd of August 44, as long as honour required it. It is as an example of patriotism and honour that Antonescu is advanced by some nationalists as a model for Romanian society today. And yet, the example, even in those two respects, is flawed. Antonescu has no credentials as a model for a democratic Romania, and while it was not he who introduced the policy of ethnic intolerance and persecution into Romania, it was he who extended it. Romanian nationalists deny this and seek to whitewash their country's record under Antonescu's rule. In 1991, on the eve of the anniversary of Antonescu's execution as a war criminal on the 1st of June 1946, the Romanian Parliament stood for 1 minute in silent tribute. The reaction of the Romanian authorities to the invitation launched by 9 Romanian foundations and societies to King Michael to attend the 50th anniversary symposium held in Bucharest in October 1994 to mark the 50th anniversary of King Michael's coup and his arrest of Antonescu on the 23rd of August 1944 said much about their values. Whilst granting Antonescu as chef de cabinet a visa to participate in the anniversary symposium, President Ion Iliescu saw fit to deny one to King Michael, the author of the coup against Antonescu. A flawed understanding of Antonescu was in evidence earlier this year when Dan Șova, spokesman of the Romanian Social Democratic Party, claimed on the Money Channel on the 5th of March, I quote, "No Jews suffered on Romanian territory thanks to Marshal Antonescu," end of quote. This remark was met with indignation from the Elie Wiesel National Institute for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania. On the 7th of March of this year, the chairman of the party, Victor Ponta, announced that Șova had been temporarily removed from the office of party spokesperson. Șova later expressed regret that his statement had been misunderstood, but he refused to apologize. And on the 6th of August of this year, Șova was appointed as the Minister for Parliamentary Relations in the present Ponta government. Ion Antonescu was Romania's ruler from the 6th of September 1940 to the 23rd of August 1944, the period of Romania's alliance with Nazi Germany and the consequent invasion of the Soviet Union. Romania retained her sovereignty throughout the period of the alliance. Respect for Romanian sovereignty was based on the identical interests which bound Hitler and Antonescu, and on the Führer's confidence in and admiration for the Romanian leader. Both had seen service in the First World War, albeit on opposing sides, and the Führer respected Antonescu's experience as a military planner. He also admired Antonescu's qualities of leadership as Romania's ruler and his dedication to the Axis. Antonescu had, of course, his own country's interest uppermost in his mind, but in following Hitler, he served the Nazi cause. He was aware of the implications of the final solution for the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, as his meeting with Hitler at Castle Klesheim in Salzburg in April 1943 shows, and he made his own particular contribution to the solution of the Jewish problem, inverted commas, by deporting Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina to Transnistria, and you can see Transnistria over there in the east on the map. In the simple dichotomies of wartime and post-war evaluation, Antonescu counts as a fascist. His was an authoritarian regime which adopted some, but by no means all, of the trappings of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. He had led, in inverted commas, a fascist government, a judgment which automatically assimilates the Iron Guard to the dominant parties in Germany and Italy. Here I'm referring to the joint leadership of the Iron Guard government, which was instituted in September 1940 and lasted until the end of January 1941. Above all, Antonescu had been an ally of those two states, that is, of Germany and Italy. Only in the 1960s did inquiry begin to discriminate between varieties of fascism and raise questions hitherto ignored or dismissed as incompatible with the prevalent orthodoxy. But it was not until the mid-1970s that the complexity and inconsistency of Antonescu's character was hinted at in Romania itself, and in the 1980s, and then outside Romania, that a discussion of Antonescu's departures from the dogmatic norm was initiated. These two approaches do more to explain his behaviour than the preceding orthodoxy. For this reason, analysis has to begin by recognising that Antonescu headed the third largest Axis army in the European war. 585,000 Romanian troops participated in the attack on the Soviet Union between June and October 1941. It has to recognise that under his rule, Romania sustained the German war effort with oil and other raw materials. Above all, that Antonescu enjoyed Hitler's personal respect, all of which places Romania on a par with Italy as a principal ally of Germany and not in the category of minor Axis satellite. Antonescu was emphatically a complex and inconsistent figure, but he inherited the Axis alignment, which is not to say that he saw an alternative to it, and he bore no responsibility for the internal political chaos which he was called to manage in September 1940. This is a major paradox of his regime. There were others. He was a war criminal, as I've said, sending tens of thousands of Jews and Romans to what he must have known would be their death in Transnistria through starvation, cold and disease, and yet he refused German requests to send other Romanian Jews to the death camps in Poland. He was an anti-Semite, and yet, despite the deportations to Transnistria, more Jews survived under his rule than in any other country within Axis Europe. While up to 300,000 Jews were victims of Antonescu's policies, some 375,000 Jews are estimated to have survived, principally in Wallachia, Moldavia and southern Transylvania. Those are the areas here in white on the map. Antonescu led for 5 months, between September 1940 and the end of January 41, a fascist-style government in a self-proclaimed national legionary state, in which the anti-Semitic Iron Guard held the key ministries. Yet in January 1941, he removed that government in 3 days of street fighting and replaced it with a military dictatorship. These inconsistencies were known, but could not be fully explored until the downfall of communism in Romania opened archives. Fear of the Soviet Union drove Romania into alliance with Nazi Germany. I quote, "Nothing could put Romania on Germany's side except the conviction that only Germany could keep the Soviets out of Romania." End of quote. And this was a remark of a member of the Romanian Foreign Ministry to the British minister in Bucharest in March 1940. That conviction was quick to form after the collapse of France, the Soviet seizure of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina at the end of June 1940, and the loss of northern Transylvania to Hungary under the Vienna Award in late August 1940. All of those territories are indicated there in various degrees of shading on the map. 1/3 of Romania's 1939 area was ceded in 1940, and with it, Romania's population fell from almost 20 millions to 13 millions. The loss of the 3 territories led King Carol to accept Hitler's frontier guarantee, one which he gave only after Carol's agreement to the Vienna Award, which saw the loss of northern Transylvania to Hungary. The same pragmatic considerations shaped the policy of Antonescu. Although Romania lost northern Transylvania at Germany's hands under the Vienna Award, it was only with German support that Antonescu could defend the country's territorial integrity and regain Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from the Soviet Union. The Soviet threat to Romania was catalogued in the Romanian government's reply to the British ultimatum of 29th of November 1941. Mention of it was suppressed during the period of communist rule in Romania because of Soviet sensibilities and actions. Romanian and Western scholars were prevented from having access to a significant part of the papers of Ioan Antonescu, for they were removed from the Romanian archives by the Soviet authorities between 1944 and 1945 and never returned. Copies of some of the files from Antonescu's office remained in Romania throughout the post-war period, and the Romanian authorities consistently denied access to most scholars before 1989. As a result, the Soviet authorities were in a position to dictate an image of the Antonescu regime, one which was faithfully presented by Soviet historiography as, I quote, criminal. It is not surprising that a class analysis of politics combined with censorship should lead one Soviet historian, Leon Levitsky, to argue in an article published in 1985 that the reason behind Antonescu's participation in Operation Barbarossa was the result of, I quote, the chauvinism of the Romanian ruling class, end of quote. This is not to deny, of course, that the Antonescu regime was anti-Soviet. In Romania, political considerations after 1945 made the subject of Romania's alliance with Germany taboo. The communist regime barred access to documents covering the years 1941 to 44. At the same time, the Romanian dead on the Eastern Front were denied official recognition and commemoration. The prospect of a pro-Soviet regime acknowledging casualties of an attack on the Soviet Union, the Romanian soldiers who died in the Russian campaign between 41 and 44, that is, proved too embarrassing. The military museum in Bucharest underlined the point. Its exhibits under communism defined the Romanian record in the Second World War by the years 1944-45, that is, the period when Romania joined the Allies in fighting against Nazi Germany. There was no mention in the Military Museum of the Romanian involvement in the German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, and no memorabilia of the campaign. The title of my presentation begs two questions. First, to what degree was Antonescu naturally predisposed towards the ideology of fascism? And second, did he succumb to its temptation? To answer the first question, an examination of his background and the milieu in which he pursued his career is required. The response to the second question lies in Antonescu's own words and deeds. Ion Antonescu had the army in his blood. Born on the 2nd of June 1882 into a middle-class family in the southern Romanian town of Pitești, that is roughly 120 kilometers over here to the west of Bucharest, and baptized into the Orthodox faith, his father, an army officer, mapped out a military career for him. Antonescu made a name for himself as a tactician during World War I, but his personal qualities left a different kind of impression with some of those he met. General Victor Pétain, France's military attaché in Bucharest, in an assessment of Antonescu dated the 21st of July 1922, expressed reservations about Antonescu, and I quote, "A well-tried intelligence, brutal, duplicitous, very vain, a ferocious will to succeed. These are, together with an extreme xenophobia, the striking characteristics of this strange figure." End of quote. Anti-Semitism was widespread and respectable amongst most Romanians. The peasants' dislike stemmed from the Jews' position as alcohol suppliers, moneylenders and middlemen in the timber trade, while the upper classes looked upon them with suspicion. Additionally, refugees from Russia during the 19th century, even though in flight from pogroms, were regarded as Russians and therefore particularly unreliable. In Bessarabia, the Jews remained a community apart from the Romanian peasant majority. Of the 207,000 Jews in Bessarabia in 1930, some 200,000 declared Yiddish to be their native language, while their second language of operation was invariably Russian rather than Romanian. Anti-Semitic feeling amongst the newly arrived Romanian officials was exacerbated by their suspicion of the Jews as Bolshevik agents, following the influx of Jewish refugees into Bessarabia in the wake of the Russian Civil War. Antonescu's career developed squarely in this milieu. I ought to point out that Romania annexed Bessarabia or was awarded Bessarabia at the end of the First World War. As Romania aligned herself more closely to Germany, so the position of the Jews became more precarious. The pro-German cabinet of Ion Gigirtu introduced a decree in August 1940 which, by changing the legal status of Jews and denying them civil and political rights, was a replica of Hitler's Nuremberg laws. With the accession of Antonescu and the Iron Guard to power and the proclamation of a national legionary state on the 14th of September 1940, new anti-Semitic measures were taken. In October, Jews were barred from renting pharmacies. Most pharmacies were either rented or owned by Jews. And at the beginning of October, rural real estate was expropriated from Jews, as were, in December, forest land, mills, distilleries and cereal stocks, and shipping at the beginning of December. The right of Jews to plead at the bar was limited by law to representation of their co-religionists as private persons, while Jewish doctors were allowed only to treat Jewish patients. Antonescu's suppression of the Iron Guard at the end of January 1941 ended a unique chapter in the history of fascism in Europe. The Iron Guard had been the only radical movement of the right in Europe to come to power without the assistance of Germany or Italy, and the only one to be toppled during Nazi Germany's domination of continental Europe. During its period of rule, through its reach for total power, the excesses of the Iron Guard police, the utter mismanagement of the state administration and the economy by inexperienced youthful militants, it antagonized most middle-class Romanians and challenged Antonescu's own political authority. Faced with the prospect of a complete breakdown of order in the country, should the Iron Guard seize complete control of the state, the officer corps stood firmly behind Antonescu and gave him its full support in his showdown with the Guard. Indeed, there was a form of civil war at the end of January 1941 in which Antonescu, with the help of the army, suppressed the Guard. On the 27th of January 41, Antonescu appointed a new cabinet formed almost entirely of army officers. Antonescu, as a soldier, saw the solution to problems in terms of raison d'etat. He established a military regime under which senior officers took their orders only from Antonescu and usually disregarded any decisions taken by other ministers in the government. Thus, in the deportation of Jews in summer 1941, which was entrusted to the army by Antonescu, army officers ignored permits issued by the Ministry of the Interior, that's not the Parks Administration, but the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Romania, which allowed individual Jews exemption. This was the case with Jews who were US citizens, for example. They were also deported to Transnistria. Antonescu openly admitted his regime's military character. In November 41, in a committee meeting, he confessed, I quote, "I now want to declare before the world that this state is a militaristic one. That is the direction in which I am pushing it. I want to introduce a patriotic, heroic, military-type education because economic education and all the others follow on from it." End of quote. A few days later, he addressed the former government in a cabinet meeting of the 27th of November 41. Again I quote, "I am by fate a dictator because I cannot return to the old constitution, nor to parliament, nor to anything, and I can only solve these problems with the state council and some experts around me in order to harmonize all the problems." End of quote. But unlike the dictatorships of Hitler and Mussolini, Antonescu's dictatorship was not based on a mass political party or ideology. Antonescu's program was a simple one: order within Romania and security for her frontiers. They were to be provided by the police and the army. In his own words to Hitler in June 41, again I quote, "He was neither a politician nor diplomat. He was born a soldier and he wanted to die one." Incidentally, Antonescu often spoke in the third person singular. That's why, rather like a bishop or monarch sometimes. That's why I use the words he here, because that's how he spoke. In a country unfamiliar with discipline, Antonescu tried to impose it. It could be argued that he wanted to corral the Iron Guard, but beyond this, his strictures sometimes extended to the ridiculous. For example, a ban on walking the streets in shirt sleeves during the summer on pain of internment. While some transgressors were actually punished in this way, the moral and spiritual regeneration sought by Antonescu did not receive the public support he hoped for. He was ultimately a lonely figure who found, apart from his wife and his mother, only two people he felt he could trust. One, Veturia, the wife of the poet and former Prime Minister Octavian Goga, and a very distant relative, Mihai Antonescu, whom he kept by his side even when Hitler asked for his dismissal in spring 1943. Mihai Antonescu was served both as foreign minister and as deputy prime minister under Antonescu, if we equate Antonescu's position with that of the prime minister. To what degree then was Antonescu's Romania a totalitarian state? As mentioned above, Antonescu did not seek to carry out a revolution based on political ideology. His rule certainly intruded into the lives of Jews and Romas, but the vast majority of Romanians were subject only to the demands of a military policy which any ruler of Romania after 1940 would have been forced to apply. Antonescu's tolerance of the democratic opposition, the simple fact that he was prepared to engage in correspondence with its leaders, and also with William Filderman, a senior figure in the Jewish community in the early months of the war, at once sets Antonescu apart from Hitler. By the draconian yardstick of the Nazi regime, Antonescu's dictatorship was less barbarous for most of its subjects, although for tens of thousands of Jews it brought deportation, starvation and death. Freedom of worship was respected for most Christians and Muslims, and although on the 17th of September 1940 restrictions had been placed on the Jews to practice their faith, at the repeated request of Filderman, the president of the Federation of the Union of Jewish Communities, Antonescu suspended their application. Antonescu is perhaps best described as authoritarian rather than as a totalitarian. There was no fascist party in power during Antonescu's dictatorship, but his rule was overtly anti-Semitic. Antonescu consolidated the anti-Semitic measures taken by King Carol's government and by the National Legionary State under his own leadership. It was on Antonescu's orders that the Foreign Ministry advised the Passport Office in March 1941 that thenceforth passports issued to Romanian citizens of Jewish origin should bear the inscription Jew or Jewess in the top left-hand corner of the first page. The criteria for applying this specification were those laid down in a law of 8th of August 1940 regarding the legal status of the Jews. A series of measures were introduced to prevent Jewish craftsmen and tradesmen from practicing their skills. At the end of March 1941, the Ministry of Labour instructed prefectures to cancel the contracts of Jews apprenticed not only to Christian employers, but to Jewish ones as well, and to stop the issue of new ones. On the same day, urban property owned by Jews was nationalised. In an effort to rationalise Romanianisation of Jewish property, the government created on the 3rd of May 1941 the National Centre for Romanianisation. It was charged with administering the assets nationalised from the Jews and with, I quote, Romanianising economic life, end of quote, and with paying the former Jewish owners compensation totalling 8 times their gross income. Much of the property confiscated from Jews was let out to Romanians. Although Mihai Antonescu claimed in March 1944 that to that date, I quote, not a single Jewish asset amongst those expropriated from the Jews in 1940 and 41 has been sold, end of quote, there are reports in the Romanian press at the time of Jewish possessions being sold by auction. Antonescu's first step in establishing order was a decree law introduced on the 6th of February 1941, which outlawed all opposition to his regime. The penalty for unauthorized political organization, including marching and singing by political groups, was set at between 10 and 25 years hard labor. The death penalty would apply to any person found in possession of arms without authorization. A series of other offences carrying the death penalty, such as espionage and treason, were added during the following months. The National Legionary State was dissolved on the 14th of February 1941, and a massive operation was launched to round up those who had taken part in the uprising, that is, members of the Iron Guard. More than 9,000 people had been arrested by the end of February 1941. A significant proportion were Orthodox priests. The military provost's office reported that some 6,800 legionaries or Iron Guardists were sentenced to imprisonment during 1941. Antonescu's measures were given the rubber stamp of a popular plebiscite on the 2nd, or between the 2nd and the 5th of March 1941, when 99.9% of the votes cast gave their approval. Swift retribution was meted out to Iron Guardists who murdered Jews after the uprising at the end of January 1941. In May, a number of Guardists found guilty of the murder of Jews in Bucharest were executed, while in July 1941, Horia Sima and other Guard leaders were sentenced in their absence to forced labour for life. Antonescu's use of the decree epitomised the authoritarian nature of his rule. The instrument used to underpin his system of repression was the internment camp, to which those judged to be opponents of his regime or a threat to it could be sent, often simply on the recommendation of senior officials in the Ministry of the Interior. Recent research offers a total figure of some 10,600 persons who were imprisoned under Antonescu, of whom just over 2,000 were communists or sympathisers. I'm not, of course, including in those figures tens of thousands of people who were deported. 72 people were executed of a total of 313 persons sentenced to death between 1940 and 44. Only those communists who were found guilty of acts of espionage or sabotage as Soviet agents were executed, while those who were shown to be members of the Communist Party of Romania had their death sentences commuted. Antonescu regarded communism and the Iron Guard as one of the same in presenting this greatest threat to Romanians and the Romanian state. He said in one cabinet meeting, now there are no longer any Guardists. There are communists in green shirts. This was the uniform of the Iron Guard. They took Codreanu's guard, Codreanu being the former leader of the Iron Guard, they don green shirts and say they are Guardists. In reality, they are communists. End of the quote. Within this statutory framework of dictatorship, as I've said earlier, Antonescu did nevertheless tolerate what might be termed dissent rather than opposition. It was expressed in the form of joint letters to Antonescu by the leaders of the National Peasant and National Liberal Party, which, while critical of his actions, regarded him as a necessary evil. Antonescu sent detailed replies, often with the offer to stand aside in favour of the two party leaders, but on each occasion the offer was either declined or ignored. This brings us finally to the question of whether Antonescu was a fascist. An answer requires us first to recognise that his period as Romanian leader, strictly speaking King Michael was still head of state, can be divided into two. From September 1940 to the end of January 1941, he led a government dominated by the Iron Guard, which he then removed and replaced with his own military dictatorship. Second, the reply hinges upon whether the National Legionary State, that is the Iron Guard state, of which he was head between September 1940 and January 41, and the subsequent 3.5 years of his dictatorship, can be described as fascist. In the sense that the period of Iron Guard government and that of subsequently military rule was characterized by military alliance with Nazi Germany and by virulent anti-Semitism, then both the Guard and Antonescu were fascist. But such a judgment, although accurate, requires qualification. The impact of modernity and the widespread rebellions against its influence in Romania on culture and religion provided the dynamics of the Guard's anti-Semitism. That anti-Semitism was in part an attempt to heal the profound malaise resulting from a constellation of factors which prevented interwar Romanians from enjoying a clear sense of identity, a collective national purpose, and what we might call a place in the modern world. Suffice it to say that if we define some of the characteristic features of fascism as a crisis of identity stemming from the traditional, often ethnic features of the community, an authoritarian paramilitary type of organization, and a backward-looking stance opposed to industrialization, then the most significant movement in Romania to which this definition could be applied was the Iron Guard. To these we can add in the Guard's case a strong anti-Semitism and a hatred of Marxism. As Henry Roberts rightly remarks, I quote, "Fascism is not generally anti-industrial, but in the case of Romania, with its particular position vis-à-vis industrial society, the fascist response in its most characteristic form involved this negation and an exaltation of the peasant." End of the quote. Antonescu and the Iron Guard entered a marriage of convenience in September 1940. The divorce in January 1941 was violent, but the prejudices which had brought them together continued to infest Antonescu's mind and drove his deeds during the remaining period of Romania's wartime alliance with Hitler's Germany. Seen in that light, Romania's military leader appears as a fascist dictator. Yet, as Stanley Payne makes clear, during the period of the National Legionary State, Antonescu was yoked, however willingly or unwillingly, to the Iron Guard in the construction of a totalitarian state. After casting aside that yoke at the end of January 1941, Antonescu was free to assume his earlier persona as, in Paine's words, I quote, an ultra-nationalist right radical rather than a genuine fascist, end of quote. And that judgment has much to support it. Yet such an assessment does not, of course, absolve Antonescu of his responsibility for the war crimes committed under his rule. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Let me maybe ask you the first question. So, I learned an enormous amount from that. So in the current debate, let's say the post-communist debate in Romania, the search for a usable past, as all of these countries are engaged in, what difference does it make whether one identifies Antonescu as a fascist or as a right-wing patriot? I mean, how does that contribute to the current debate in Romania about its own past?
It's because the word fascist for Remains is so loaded that Romanians feel that they're being assimilated into the program that is attached to the Nazi regime, and therefore many seek to distance that association by claiming that Antonescu wasn't fascist, by trying to, let's say, minimize Antonescu's involvement in what a number of scholars would call the Romanian role in the Holocaust. And even this use of the term Holocaust is disputed in Romania. You'll find a number of Romanian historians claiming that there was no Holocaust in Romania, there were deportations, but because Holocaust is associated with industrialized mass killings, and Antonescu was not involved in industrialized mass killings, so the argument is advanced that A, he's not fascist, B, he's not a mass murderer.
Right. So it's more acceptable to say that he was just a right-wing patriot who deported Jews,
who was defending Romania's
right.
interests.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Questions? Comments?
Yeah. In your research, did you find many source materials amongst German letters about, what was the kind of the German perspective on Antonescu?
Well, I didn't find many documents in the Holocaust Museum from the German side, but since I started my research there, I have been involved with a project looking at German documents and assessment of Romania's role in the Holocaust, and all those documents are in a weighty brick of a volume, which appeared in
Is there correspondence between?
Yeah, well, what we found, my friend in Romania, Ratiu, who works at the Institute of History of the Romanian Academy, we worked together in going through the German archives, and we looked at the reports of the Einsatzgruppen, for example, because they passed through northern Romania on their way into the rest of the Ukraine, or part of the Ukraine, depends on your point of view. And we were rather shocked at the reports. For example, one officer of the Einsatzgruppen writes, the Romanians don't know how to murder Jews. I mean, I'm quoting verbatim, they just leave their bodies by the sides of the road instead of collecting them and disposing of them. And there are other reports from German officers from the Wehrmacht who claim that the Romanians are so disorganized that they bring disrepute to the Axis armies. I mean, so it's rather sort of, well, it's chilling to read these documents. The Germans, I must say, the German army, or German officers had a high regard for the Romanian soldier, the peasant, but a very low opinion of Romanian officers. And the fact that Romanian officers, for example, in the campaign on the Eastern Front, didn't eat with the troops, whereas often German officers did. And there was this very strong class division between officers in the Romanian army and the peasant soldier. Yeah.
Do the Romanian historians who attempt, or I guess rather, what do the Romanian historians who attempt to say that there was no Holocaust in Romania have to say about some of the mass shooting actions of Jews that were carried out by the Romanian army, like after the fall of Odessa or the massacres in like Barthanovka? Do they claim that was the Germans?
Yes.
They just ignore that?
Yeah, that's right. They claim it was the work of Germans. And if you talk, as I occasionally do in Romania, I'm invited to talk about Antonescu, invariably there is some dispute at the end of my talk because people will get up and say I'm anti-Romanian or that I'm trying to calumny the Romanian state and so on. And it's quite, their views are quite simply based on ignorance. They've not been into the archives, they don't know what, in fact, Romanian officials themselves report about what's going on, because the figures I present in my paper and indeed in my book and my other articles about the deportations of Jews are figures provided by the governors of the provinces to which Jews and Romans have been deported. So they're not Western-based estimates, figures. They are figures that we get from the Romanian documents themselves, and they come from reports which, in fact, Mihai Antonescu asked to be sent to him, especially in November 1943. So trying to, as I say, trying to minimize the scale of the deportations is a futile exercise if you really are genuinely interested in what happened as regards the whole policy of deportation and its implementation in that period.
Right. I had a question also about class divisions between the officer corps and well, I was wondering, because there were often significant differences within these societies between the aristocrats and members of these right-wing fascist groups, whether we're talking about the Nazis or the fascists in Italy. With the Iron Guard, was there some sort of tension between Antonescu and other officers around him in the 1930s before his assumption of I guess the premiership in 1940, between them and the rank and file of the Iron Guard, and sort of the common popular right-wing movements in
Yeah, there was a good deal of tension between Antonescu, because he'd served as Minister of War in 1937-38, and he had often expressed to King Carol his concern that the Iron Guard had risen in power, certainly because it became the third party in the elections of December 1937. So Antonescu is on record as expressing his concern, but his concern stems from the fact that the Iron Guard was really a rabble. You know, it was a disorganized group of figures who were bent on, we would call them a terrorist group today, but it was used murder or assassination as a political tool, and this is what disturbed Antonescu as an officer. And alongside him, he had many figures in the army, senior figures in the army, who, while they certainly were anti-Semitic, nevertheless did not share the Iron Guard's worldview of creating, first of all, disorder, to put some form of order into place instead, although of course that was impossible given the actions of the Iron Guard once it came to power. Even the Germans, once they entered Romania in October 1940, so the German army entered, and also a large number of German officials came to take control of parts of the Romanian economy under treaties signed between Nazi Germany and Antonescu. The German officials were taken aback by the manner in which Iron Guard ministers sought to exploit ministries, if you like. They sought to, by corruption really, to really empty the coffers of each of the ministries they were in control of. Part of the German complaint stemmed from their, we might say, resentment that they themselves would have liked, I expect, to exploit the various ministries in some way, and the Iron Guard beat them to it, so to speak. But nevertheless, when you read German documents, you can see that there was so much corruption in the administration, in those ministries at which stood the who were under the control of the Iron Guard ministers. So much corruption there that even the Germans found it difficult to stomach.
Did you question?
Yeah, sure. So to what extent, to what extent was Antonescu's alliance or partnership with the Germans, I guess, a nationalistic attempt to consolidate land claims, for example, Transylvania, And I mean, was his alliance with the Germans? Did he intend to have some sort of post-war partnership with Germany should that happen, or was it mainly Romanian claims such as taking Transylvania, etc.?
Well, he saw, yeah, that's a good question. Yes, he certainly saw Hitler as a channel to regaining northern Transylvania, even though it had been Hitler who determined or supervised the Vienna Award. And as I pointed out, this is why Antonescu refused Hitler's offer of annexation, of Romania's annexation of Transnistria. He always felt that, he once said that the road to northern Transylvania lies through Transnistria, and he meant, I'm going to help the Germans there, but my ultimate goal is to get the Germans to restore northern Transylvania to Romania. The irony is that the person who restores northern Transylvania to Romania is Stalin in March 1945.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
First is a follow-up to yours. In terms of, I guess, the difference between the right-wing ultra-nationalist and fascist, is it the industrial, one wants to promote industrialism and the other one doesn't, because Francisco Franco, he's known as a fascist.
Yeah.
Is that the difference?
Well, that's why I quoted Stanley Payne there, that fascism in Romania doesn't fit neatly into this compartmentalization of fascism that was begun really in the 1960s, the end of the 1960s. Romania stands out, or the fascist movement, we might say, the Iron Guard movement, distinguished itself from, say, the movement in Italy or Germany by its emphasis on religion, first of all, and the, as I was saying, the exaltation of the peasant, to the detriment of industrialization. And this is a feature of Romanian fascism, which leads some scholars to then say, well, Romania isn't really a fascist state because it doesn't fit into, as I say, the categories that are normally, or the definitions of fascism that we normally apply. I would say that the fascist regimes in Central Europe really merit further examination. They're understudied, and they're just lumped together with Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany as though they were just excrescences of that movement. But the truth is that they brought their own contribution to the fascist ideology. They defined fascism in their own terms. And so when we're looking at fascism, we really need to extend our area of investigation, I think, very much to Slovakia, for example, to Romania, to Hungary. Yeah, because they offer their own variations on the general theme, as I say, which lead us to, I think, can lead us to question what exactly does fascism mean.
So the second part was that character reference, I think you said by the French attaché, described him as vain and xenophobic. Was that written before his ascension to power, or was that after the war?
Before. It was written in 1922 in French diplomatic report. So Pétain writes back to Paris and says he met Antonescu, and that was his view of him.
Thank you. I'm curious about the domestic reaction to or sentiment about his policies during this time, and how it set up Romanian politics for post-1946, the next transition. So there's anything to say.
Well, after the war, as I said, Antonescu was really a taboo figure immediately after the war because he participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and mention of him really was removed from any, first of all from textbooks in Romania, because there was a law introduced by the Ministry of Education in '46 which listed a whole number of titles of books which should be withdrawn from Romanian libraries. As you can imagine, several of them referred to Antonescu and the campaigns in 1941, his part in Barbarossa. Incidentally, also works which had been authored, or speeches by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, General de Gaulle, they were all withdrawn from libraries after 1946 as well. So Antonescu was in more auspicious company, I would say. But it wasn't until Romania started to deviate, you might say, from the Soviet norm in the early 60s really, under Georgiev, when it started to pursue its autonomous course, that we begin to see in the history of Romania, which was a state-sponsored volume, 4-volume work, that Antonescu's name reappears. But there's no evaluation of him. It's simply a factual presentation of Antonescu having been Romania's wartime leader, and no mention of Romania's attack on the Soviet Union. Simply there's mention of Russia's or the Soviet Union's annexation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in 1940, in the summer of 1940. And no mention of the Soviets' re-annexation in 1944, that is in the summer, the de facto annexation, and then it's under the Paris Peace Treaty of 47 it was legalized, the occupation. Only really under Ceausescu in the late 70s do we get Antonescu appearing, first of all, interestingly enough, in novels, we might say certified novels of the regime, where he appears as a figure and a sort of rather tragic figure faced with this dilemma as to which dictatorship should he align, or with which dictatorship should he align himself? Should it be with the Soviets or with Nazi Germany? That's how he's presented. And then in 1980 we get a much more overt critique, you might say, of the Soviet Union, its actions after the war, and this presentation of Antonescu as a patriotic honourable figure, which is carried over after the revolution, which is not surprising because many of those historians who advanced the new version of Antonescu continued to write after 1989, and indeed were encouraged by certain political groupings in Romania to write in that vein. When I was a student, many, more than 40 years ago in Romania, and I went to the military museum because I was interested in Romania's military history, and that's how I know that when I entered the room dedicated to the Second World War, the period 1941 to 44 was empty. And I asked my guide, who was a young student, Romanian student, I said, well, where's Romania 1941-44? Yeah, 44-45 I understand, but 41-44 is not there. And he said to me, don't be cheeky, don't be irreverent, he said. Which I thought, was, of course, an interesting reflection of official policy.
Blank spaces,
Yeah.
blank rooms.
Yeah, the room was just
4 years of
empty.
history.
There had been at some stage some exhibit, I imagine in 1945.
Sure.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was the perception of U.S. authorities on Antonescu's regime at this time, the Second World War?
Well, certainly the Romanian the U.S. the American minister in Romania was very critical of the Iron Guard, generally speaking, and then when it came to power under Antonescu in September 1940, you can see reading his dispatches here in the National Archives here that are highly critical of what was going on in terms of especially the anti-Semitic legislation. Sadly, he died, the American minister, of an incurable disease and is buried in Bucharest, in a cemetery there. And so his first secretary took over, but there's a consistent criticism of what is going on in Romania from really the mid-30s. You can see it in the dispatches, as you find in the British dispatches as well. I mentioned in my paper that the US legation in Romania protested at the deportation of American citizens to Transnistria because it was learned that US Jews were sent off to various camps in Transnistria, and some of them died there. We've got the records here in the Holocaust Museum, relatives of those Jews and American citizens, again, writing to the US government saying, why has my uncle been deported to one of the camps, I can't remember which one. But there's an interesting article about that by Ernest Latham, who has studied the fate of US citizens under, or especially Jews, under Antonescu, which was published about 3 months ago. in a publication in Romania, in a collection of his articles, Dennis Deletant's articles, which were published in Romania. If you wanted to follow up on that, you could find them. I could certainly give you a reference to it.
Can I ask you a naive question? What were these people doing in Romania in the 1940s? And the ones who were US citizens and
well,
Jewish? I mean,
yeah.
just a question.
One can only say that they were rather naive, I would put it, because I think it's because, as we can see from the behaviour of Romanians, if you had money, and because the officials were corruptible, you could get by, you could survive. And that is one way in which a number of Jews did survive. What is interesting also for me is, despite the fact that tens of thousands of Jews were deported, you find the Jews in the camps in Transnistria writing to the head of the Jewish Federation in Romania, William Philby, asking to be repatriated. So you've got Jews who've been deported asking to be repatriated to a Romania that is very anti-Semitic. Not asking, as they could have done, to be put on the list of Jews who were trying to get to Palestine. Right. Because there were different strategies employed by Jews who were in the camps in Transnistria. So of course you ask yourself what was going on in their mind. Perhaps they felt that they could, as I say, obviate the official policy by paying large sums of money. Many Jews who were deported had handed over their jewellery and money to officials from the Romanian army. Again, we've got whole registers of jewellery that was given to officers, but the Jews were still deported.
And just one more question in that vein. So after the war, when the communists came to power, obviously there were some quite prominent people, Romanians of Jewish origin. I'm assuming all of those people spent the war years in the Soviet Union.
Well, some did, but there were 400 of them who were interned in a special camp in Transnistria, and these were the ones who were, some of them had been sentenced to death, but as I mentioned, they had sentences for commuting.
Yeah.
And it was those who, they who returned to Romania after the war, in fact after August 44, and they'd been, of course, long-term members of the Communist Party, so they were able to advance fairly rapidly within the party. I got to interview several of them in the early 80s when I was interested in Antonescu, although it was a rather sort of risque subject, but they were glad to talk to me about their experiences during the war. And for me it was just fascinating, because there was nothing in print about it, in a secondary source.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
So regarding Antonescu's characterization as vain and crass, was there any sort of personality cult under his rule? I mean, obviously nothing to the extent of Ceausescu there.
Well, there was a form of personality cult, but very, I would say, minimal compared with that of Ceausescu. What struck me, we're looking at the files of Antonescu's trial. The Romanian authorities, under Soviet pressure, put Antonescu on trial in May 1946. So I looked at all the court documents, and there are 40 volumes of them. I went through all the volumes. Each volume is about 300 pages. So I spent a lot of time in the Romanian archives. But what struck me was that there were so few letters of protest from Romanian citizens about the conditions in Romania during the war. And we know that despite the propaganda of the period that was leveled, the standard of living was still fairly high, that there was no rationing and so on, allegedly. But you've only got to look at Romanian newspapers to discover that there was rationing. But there are still scholars, Western scholars even, who claim there was no rationing in Romania during the war. Well, they got to read Romanian newspapers at the time. But when you do that, you realise that Antonescu did enjoy a fairly easy ride internally, that a good proportion of the population appears to have supported him from this lack of evidence of complaints about his regime in his own archive, that which we would call the presidency of the council, because those were letters which he received personally. There are I think no more than 40 letters I came across protesting about various aspects of his regime. For example, the deportation of 2,000 neo-Protestants to Transnistria, who belonged to Protestant sects. So they were deported to Transnistria, and there are some letters from relatives complaining about this. Also relatives of Jews who served in the Romanian army during the First World War, who'd been decorated with the highest medals of valor, who were deported to Transnistria. And Antonescu did try to get these Jews, there are about 115 of them, I seem to recall. He tried to get them brought back to, or released from the internment camps in Transnistria, but sadly a number of them were already dead by the time he went to leave.
Any other questions, comments? If not, please join me in thanking Professor Deletant for a very interesting I look forward to reading more.
Yeah, well, this is just part of an article, of a chapter from a book which is coming out next year on Dreams of Power, it's called, and I was asked to address the case of Antonescu.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.